Prakhya, and I'm convinced that I could be the next vegetarian master chef.
Lovely. That's an interesting side of you, which I don't think we'll get to talk too much about on the podcast today, but would love to hear more later. So this is Prakhya Gadde. She's an alumni of USC, the University of Southern California, in Los Angeles, where she majored in architecture. Today we'll be hearing more from her about sort of the choices she's made, lessons she's learned along the way, and just some advice she would like to give to high schoolers who are about to embark on an exciting next phase of their life called university. So welcome to University Unraveled. I'm your host, Arya Darod. I just completed a year at Minerva University in San Francisco. Welcome, Prakhya. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So you graduated from USC in 2020, then completed your master's more than a year ago now. Walk through, share with the audience what you're currently working on.
Okay, so I've currently moved back to Hyderabad, where I'm originally from, and I'm joined my parents' architecture firm, where I work as a design director. I also take on a lot of initiatives in terms of business development, whether that be new branding strategies or even getting in social media, like changing up our tech, things like that. And it's been really cool because I'm starting to do both sides, the design and the business side of it. And it's been a really fun process so far.
Yeah, I'm sure it must be great for your parents to have like an outside perspective. Someone who's also been outside of the home and detached from the business for quite a few years, and then coming in with sort of new ideas and new insights. I'm sure it must be good family dynamics also to be learning from two really good architects, just as your learning experience as a mentee, if I can like say that.
Yeah.
What's rewinding even further back, would love to start with where the passion for architecture came from and how did you know that this was the field that you wanted to major in at university and then devote your career to? Where did the interest or the passion come from?
Yeah, like I mentioned, like both, or like you mentioned, actually, both my parents are architects, and we do have our own firm, like what I'm working at. So pretty much since I was born, like all I've heard is about architecture, about design ideas, things that they would discuss clients and projects and things at home. So our dinner table conversation most days was about architecture, about our whatever was going on at the firm. And even our vacations ended up being almost these like field trips to see new projects, new ideas. I remember when I was young, like we would go to a certain project, my dad would point out these like minute details being, oh, look at that, like they did a really good job, or something else that's not working. So almost like every vacation or anywhere we went, it didn't even need to be vacation, but anytime we went out of the house, it started to become like a case study kind of thing. And my life pretty much became about architecture since I was very young. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And I think I pretty much knew since, I mean, I had to officially decide, I guess, like in before I moved to IB versus CBSE and things like that. So I decided like officially that I was going to do architecture, moved into IB to be able to pursue that better in the US and things like that. So it just, I pretty much knew always.
What were your IB subjects which led up to USC?
Yeah, so it was visual arts in the HLs were visual arts, math, and no, business. Yeah, business. And my SLs were English, environmental studies, because I always wanted to go into the sustainability aspect of architecture. And I'm forgetting what the last one was. I'm pretty history, I'm guessing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I want to get this out of the way. I asked this to all architects and interior designers I know. What's the level of math involved both in your coursework and then in the actual work? And what are specific math concepts that are worth focusing on for someone who wants to get further in architecture? And what are entire concepts that can sort of be left to the side because it's not relevant?
Honestly, everything can be left to the side. Like that's just my unless you're trying to get into like structures and civil architecture and civil engineering, that definitely changes. But if you're looking at the design aspect of architecture, sure, you need to know like certain amount of ratios and things like that. But that's very basic math. All these like calculus and all of that, I don't personally think is that important. We definitely do have physics requirements and math requirements in school that you could waive out of because you've done math in, like, especially I think in India, like our level of math is way higher. So
Hmm.
we're able to waive out of a lot of the math requirements. I personally didn't take physics in high school, so I had to take it in college. So that's where it comes in work. Like even with a couple of business courses, I also did a minor in business, so I had to do the accounts, finance, and all of that. So that comes into play.
Hmm.
But I think in like real life, like sure, you need to know certain conversions. Like working in India, it's about meters. Working in the US, it's in feet. Certain things like that, like you have to mentally be able to know certain ratios. But other than that, like I wouldn't say it's very math heavy.
And what was the difficulty level of the physics courses you took at USC? Was that also a basic level?
Yeah, it's like I would say like a mid level. It's not exactly basic, but and especially because you start to take structures classes. When you start off as like a physics requirement, it's pretty basic. But then later in your years, around like senior year, you start to take serious structures courses where you then need to start to learn like wind loads, things like that. That gets a little bit more impactful. But in like real day life, like you have consultants on board, you have, and everything now is pretty much digitized. If I want to find out like if something's going to be able to stand or like take the load, I can always just put in the calculation online and find out.
Hmm. Interesting. Love the clarifications about math and physics. I know this is something that I have juniors interested in architecture who dislike math and physics, so that's sort of a barrier. But I tell them that from whatever I've heard is just it's not super intense, but it's good to know like the basics, as you mentioned.
I
So
personally was not a physics person either. Like math I was fine with, physics not at all. I didn't even take it
yeah,
well in like IB, so it's completely fine without it.
sounds good. I'm curious why you're currently working in Hyderabad with your parents' firm. I'm curious why the decision to go abroad. I'm sure there's great architecture programs here in India. What sort of value did could going to the US specifically have brought you over like India or even any other country?
Yeah, I think it's well, it's multiple factors, but the main two ones would be one, I wanted to get like an exposure abroad because of what we discussed before. My parents have studied, worked here for
Mm,
most of their lifetime, and they have a certain set of experiences that they've gained over the years. And I wanted to be able to bring in a fresh perspective and also an international
mm,
perception towards architecture that I would only learn by being abroad. And I did look at a lot of countries. I looked at the UK, I looked at Italy, I then like also looked at US. But what I really liked about the programs in the US were that you were able to focus on more than just architecture, whether that be like I ended up taking a minor in business because that was also one of my other interests. But even outside of that, say like I didn't want to take a minor, I had so many other requirements, even or elective options. Like you're required to take courses outside of your major,
mm.
that, that being like social studies or humanities or whatever it is. And through that, I ended up taking some very interesting courses in itself, but also just having the option to be able to like pursue my other interest in business was one of the main factors.
If does anything come to mind, next question I want to ask is, are there any countries that are maybe off someone's radar, but specifically if you want to pursue architecture, this is a country where an undergrad could have a good experience, something which is actually not on the radar, like leaving aside US, UK, Canada. Does any other country come to mind for a good architecture program?
I mean, Europe's like the best in architecture, right? Anywhere in Europe, Italy, Germany, like anywhere. Even France has some of like the best architecture colleges. The only reason even I hesitated even in going there is sometimes you perceive a language barrier that's going to exist before you even go. Like things are changing a lot. I think when I was going in 2016, they just started like making all lectures in English,
Hmm.
but it was still like the transition was still starting to go on. It became a requirement that hadn't previously been there, but now it's pretty much like ingrained in that like most lectures are going to be in English and guest lectures and all of that as well. But so I think things are like easier now than it was when I was going. But definitely like Germany, Italy, like some of the best university, and you get to like actually learn
Hmm.
from very renowned European architects in those schools.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just speaking from like a slightly younger perspective, I know you graduated in 2020. I have friends studying in Germany, Italy, France. 90% they still have language requirements, but most of their courses are in English. So I'm glad that the change you're speaking about, I can see that it definitely happened. And Europe is a great place and a very different place to pursue an undergrad, especially for a course like architecture, where you're literally surrounded in cities with stunning architecture. So, anything special or unique about USC's architecture program specifically, which drew you to USC?
Okay, I won't say the program in itself. I think it's a multitude of factors. After a point, like all top universities start to have pretty similar or courses. Like, yeah, sure, like a lecture here might differ, an elective there might differ, but they pretty much start to look the same. For me personally, it was the opportunity of being in LA. Like I've always been a city girl, having grown up in Hyderabad. But more than that, it's about I got to explore the architecture in LA, got to explore life in LA, which as much as you say, okay, like don't choose your school just based on the location, I think it makes a big difference where you choose to put yourself in for 4 years. Like if you're someone who doesn't like being in the suburbs and you're put there with nothing to do, you're going to start resenting where you are. So it really is about the overall experience. I think when you start to think of college, everyone starts to think in terms of just your course and like, is this the best in that course, etc. But it's so much more than that. Like it's about that's where you live for 4 years. Those are the kind of people you're about to meet for the next 4 years. So it's a whole overall experience that needs to get factored in.
Yeah, I'm super glad you brought that up. I feel like it's not just those two or three things like prestige or how good the course is. I think there's so many things to consider when choosing a university. You brought up location, I think very important. A lot of my friends are in college towns currently, and they have grown up in a big city, and so that's a very new experience for them. Some are enjoying it, some aren't as much. I think people is huge, both in terms of faculty themselves and the kind of people you'll be spending your time with, studying with in class and doing projects with is also very important. The kind of students who, one, go to USC in your case, and two, the kind of students who take an architecture major.
Yeah.
uh, I know for certain friends, they intended to study a particular major in university, and they ended up switching to something slightly different just because of the peer group. Like that
Mhm.
peer group also makes such a big difference.
Really does.
Yeah.
I think that's like your biggest support system. What when you're away from home, if you're not able to really like gel well with that, then it makes things definitely harder.
For sure, for sure. I know I'm rewinding even further, many, many years ago for you now, but I want to get back to high school days, and grade 9, 10, 11, 12.
Mhm.
And just curious as to, did you engage in any specific projects or activities related to architecture during those high school days as extracurriculars, which you then put on your university application, which one showed you that this is a field you're passionate about, and two, I'm sure made you stand out as a good candidate for an architecture program in USC? If you could just walk through a few of those experiences.
Yeah, so one, I already started to take visual art as like a HL subject in IB, which I think definitely helped in terms of portfolio when it came to curing a portfolio for architecture schools. But just outside of that, I've always been interested in art. So I've taken art classes here and there, like worked on a lot of projects on my own. But I think when it came to university specifically, I started to realize that like I've always been in my comfort zone in terms of mediums. I started to try to experiment more, whether that be in terms of going 3D or even
Mm.
making like sculptures or whatever, like, or even like going digital, trying to work with Photoshop, or there's so many other things now. Back then, like Photoshop was like your big digital art medium, but now like you use Mid Journey or whatever. Like everyone's trying to see how creative you can be, especially with AI. If you used AI tools to make like great art, like people would appreciate that. And I was involved in a lot of things. So I was a tennis player at the time. I was into horse riding. I was also like volunteering my weekends at an orphanage here. Like, so there was a lot of things I was doing. And that's what universities really like to look at, as someone who's involved in their community, also all rounded. They're not looking for someone who's just going to fit in that program or in that classroom. They're trying to see someone who would fit into your university as a whole, how what kind of clubs they would be joining, what kind of impact they would be like having, and also what kind of alumni they would make once they graduate. Right. So you want someone who's a lot more like well-rounded. You could, I mean, I'm not saying you have to be. You could definitely be a master of one thing, but if you're not like mastered at something, it's also great to have like a well-rounded approach.
Yeah, I mean, a senior explained this to me very nicely once that if you had to go to a university where everyone had like an IB 40 on 40, 40 45 on 45, 100% marks versus a university where everyone had slight good marks, but they like, let's say below 40, but they were just super interesting people. Like they were athletes and they were into volunteering and they had traveled the world. Like, which kind of peer group would you rather have in university? So I think just something as simple as being an interesting and multifaceted and multi-talented person is great, despite applying for a specific major, like showing that you have extracurriculars to back your interest in a major, but also underrated things like tennis and horse riding in your case, I think just shows that you do stuff beyond just study and do architecture all the time. And I'm sure these are things which lead you to make friends in different groups, in a tennis group or a horse riding group at university as well.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
this I'm probably a good person to host because I have almost net zero knowledge about architecture and the requirements. So when you said portfolio, I'm a business major. I didn't apply with any sort of portfolio. Mine was a traditional application. I
Yeah,
know arts majors, like film majors, do submit a portfolio of work. So in
yeah.
your case, as an architecture major, did you have to submit a portfolio of just art you had created? How did
Yeah,
that?
so it's art that you've created, and really depends university to university. Some of them just require like a 15 to 20 like showcase of your work, 50 to 20 pieces kind of thing. And some of them have like a very specific requirement of like we want a couple of things that are sculptural, we want one oil painting. Like it really depends. Like they have some have like a very specific list. Some even in fact have like challenges trying to see like draw a. I remember this from like Rhode Island School of Design where they like draw a bicycle. That
Hmm.
was as simple as that. Like send us a drawing of a bicycle, but it was in your realm to be as creative as possible with it. Like I remember my submission for that being trying to almost create a cityscape that looked like a bicycle.
Hmm.
So it really is like how creative you can get with it. Um, and but yeah, the portfolio is pretty much like just a showcase of your works. And I personally would suggest have as much like variety of work that you can. Like you could be a great sketch, like someone who's great at sketching, but like if that's all you have, it might not be as impactful as someone who's tried multiple things. Maybe they're not the best at everything, but they've at least tried. And another thing I would say is like having proficiency in softwares like the summer before school or before like summer before applications are due. If you try to learn a little bit of AutoCAD or Revit or Rhino, whichever of these like architecture softwares that we do use, and try to maybe showcase that in the portfolio in some way. Even like Photoshop, one of the more easier ones to work with. If you had any of these digital software skills as well, that would put you on such a high platform already.
Was 3D modeling also a big part of your course at USC using Blender and AutoCAD and all of those software?
Um, Not as much. Like it definitely started to be a little bit part of it towards I think the third year. Like we mostly use Rhino in terms of like drawings and like 3D. But I will say like a lot of it is hand modeling. Like you physically make your models. Sure, you use like 3D models in order to extract like drawings out of, and you need these like whatever plans, elevation, axon drawings, and things. So you create the model to be able to extract those easier, like a 3D digital model.
Hmm.
But we had so much like handmade model like requirements that it honestly would get really taxing after a point.
So you also have to be working with your hands. Like someone who's just doing digital art, advice is to sort of start using your hands because that'll be a part of your coursework at university.
Yeah.
Um, and just to recap what you highlighted in terms of your portfolio of art submission, they're looking for creativity. They're looking for a diversity of mediums. And detached to that, they would love to see good use of software,
Yeah.
specifically for an architecture course. So love it. I mean, these are very practical, insightful tips, especially for 11, 12 grader who is intending on doing architecture from someone like you who's done the undergrad, the master's, and is now even working in the field. To wrap up this is the first segment of this conversation. Just to wrap up, any macro or super specific advice for a high schooler who's currently working on their university applications?
Yeah, I think like one big thing is we try so hard to be someone that universities want us to be. After a point, like I've worked with like on campus couple of times with friends who worked in the admissions department and things as well. They're sick of hearing what they think they should be hearing. Like, be yourself, be your completely unique self. You bring in a lot more when you do that to the school and a lot more interest in your application than when you're trying to like be the cookie cutter. Like, this is what they would want to hear.
Mm, that's a great piece of advice. Yeah, absolutely. I've heard very similar things from friends working in admissions as well. I think after evaluating a certain number of applications, you can also kind of see through when someone is being fake about something or someone is just trying to please you with fancy words versus when someone is being super authentic and admitting a lot of things openly
Yeah.
because you're not a perfect person at like 18, 19 applying. You have faults. So being strategic about mentioning them, but I think mentioning them and showing vulnerability, even on my essay, I think I got good feedback on my essay because of specific vulnerabilities I mentioned.
Yeah,
So,
and I've heard that a lot too. And another thing is like I'm pretty sure a lot of people go through counselors to get into like school. Like and counselors want you to paint this perfect picture and they're so used to doing so many applications that that's the viewpoint that they see. Like I think at some points it's good to take your own stand and be like, no, this is me, like this is what I want to put in and add in on my application. It's fine to like I'm not saying completely go against like everything people are telling you, but it's definitely okay to push for your voice to be heard.
that's a good distinction. Yeah. This was an interesting segment. This was just the first part of the conversation. I think it gave listeners a good context as to where you're coming from, right from high school to undergrad to masters and what you're currently working on. So this was before university. Would love to, again, this is not the present for you. This is still the past, but I want to talk about during university days.
Mhm.
First question I want to ask is I was very fortunate to spend a week of my November break in the city of Los Angeles. Love the city, love the museums. I have a lot of places which I really want to visit again. But for our conversation, I would love to highlight that architecture in the city is superb. And so I'm sure some aspect of your courses involved going specifically on site, on field trips to the city to study architecture. So just walk through those field trips, how they look like, the frequency, and also um, I know this is something we understand, but just would love to stress for applicants, especially for a major like yours, why it's so important to go out, not just study in the classroom, but go out there and see good works and analyze them.
Yeah. Oh my God, we've had so many field trips.
Mhm.
Um, I think one per semester, definitely, but it really again depends on the professor. There's some professors who really love showing people while teaching. So we've had up to four field trips in certain classes. Some like you don't have as many. It really depends. Like I remember one of our first projects, like this was freshman year, right out of the gate. We were taken to this place called the Schindler House, which was a very iconic house in LA because two families tried to live together in one house. So it was like a very interesting concept, a very unique concept. And this was like like I think built in like the 1900s. So it's pretty a very fresh concept at the time. So we had to analyze this house and then reimagine it to like what it would look today. So you get very interesting projects like that. And we've gone on a lot more. Like you said, LA has some beautiful architecture, like everything from the Disney concert hall to which is a more modern piece of architecture to like MoMA and LACMA, which I think is like the more touristy side of the architecture. But we've also gone, like I mentioned, Schindler House. We've also gone to Lowell House, Hollyhock House, all these iconic like 1900s or 1800 architecture, which has been like such a journey. And I think like what you asked me is how important is it to be outside of just the coursework, right? It is so important because in class, you're learning on a screen, you're trying to analyze a house based on pictures. Sure, like you'll get some idea. Like now, when you're so into architecture for the last like I've been since like 6 years, or you have enough experience over like 10 or 12 years, you're able to visualize better when you're first joining the course, it's so hard for you to visualize spaces. And say I'm like learning about this house on a sheet of paper. I can physically be like, okay, yeah, this is a foot, this is like 3 feet, whatever, this room is 10 feet, whatever. But unless you're in that space, you don't get the experience of that space. You don't get to analyze the small details that they've very smartly done or done wrong. It can be either one of the two, right? Like, and I remember the Schindler House. We'd been researching about it before we even went to the project. And we all thought we knew what we were getting into. We walk in, and the ceilings are like maybe like 6 inches above our head, right? Like they're all really short. Like none of us were expecting that because we saw certain plans. We're like, oh, yeah, look, okay, this is the house. We even like went as far as like trying to like how our professors created a 3D model to kind of show us like analyzing the 3D model. But unless you're in the space, you're not realizing what you're getting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Not just for architecture majors, maybe for, I'm sure for architecture majors, this was very valuable. I think getting out and engaging with the city you're in is valuable for any major, be it going to companies or meeting professionals in that field, going and doing hands-on work will teach you, unlike any classroom lecture can teach you. And this is from years of my experience and also years of just hearing this from tons of seniors and alumni, that even once they graduate, these field trips and things like study abroad programs are what they remember a lot more than what they learned in a lecture hall or in the classroom. So
Yeah, no, definitely. We all used to have this joke back in school, being like, once the is over, that topic is completely done. Like, I'm sure in high school too, you have that same thing, right? Like, the year's done. I'm choosing to forget this information kind of thing. And it honestly starts to become like that because you're put it in, like, you have so much information fed to you at all times, whether that be with your architecture courses or outside of architecture, like whatever, like your major courses, your other requirements, like you're also socializing. There's just so much being put on you at all times that you don't remember those classroom things. You remember the little like details outside. And yeah, like any time that you interact with an industry professional or like even an industry practice, like or something that's just been built and done that you can physically analyze, or someone you can like properly talk to about like what their day to day looks like, whatever it is, any knowledge that's been gained in the field is definitely infinitely more important than a classroom. Not saying don't go to classes, but you know.
this is a more specific point of question at USC specifically. Were your professors people who had worked in the world of architecture, or were they more just academics who had studied and theoretically learned? Because I'm sure both are valuable, but how was the mix?
So it honestly, yeah, I mean, obviously both exist, but it's honestly a really good mix because we've had a lot more adjunct, like younger professors in our like time there than I heard about like previously. So we started to get a lot of like people in their 30s, 40s, like professors who were still working in the field at the time. So sometimes they would even take you to like trips to their offices. So you got to explore the way they work and things like that, which was way more important because they also were better equipped to understand the context of today's time than were the more academic professors. But it also depends on the courses, right? Like things like structures and things like that. Like academic courses, good. Like you have more professors that are more academically oriented are like more. I think are the ones that teach courses like history, structures, whatever. But like studio projects, they try to keep like adjunct professors so that they have that like touch with reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that in Minerva for economics, the super theoretical, just economic models class is taught by a totally academic professor, and a class on global developmental economics is taught by a part-time professor who also works at the World Bank. So I love when professors are placed well into a class, if it's more theoretical or more practical. And the professor, I believe, should also be like a theoretical professor works beautifully for that super theoretical class, and a practical professor with experience works super well for in your case, the studio classes.
Yep.
So very valuable, and it's a good mix. Since it's been a while since you graduated, and now you can speak about this in retrospect, I'm curious how each year at USC look different for you as a freshman and then sophomore, junior, senior, in terms of focus, priorities, mindsets, feel free to talk about things that stayed the same all 4 years, but also how was each year at university different? Like, what were you optimizing for each year?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so it's such a whirlwind when you first get to college, like everything's suddenly new, and you change at a rate that you would never think was possible unless you're in it. Right,
Mm,
like the first day I walked in, I like met my roommates. I was completely overwhelmed. This was my first time like going to be living alone, like many other people. And my roommates were just as overwhelmed. We didn't know how to talk to each other, but we were excited. Like you have that nervous, like excited energy. And a great thing like US colleges do is have welcome week, right? Like, and just through all these activities, being part of it together, I'd already made some of like the closest friends I could imagine in a week. Like, if you said this to someone outside of university, they'd be like, "Oh, like a week? What do you even know about each other? Like, how can you be friends?" Right? Like, that's the kind of pace like life goes at when you're there. And honestly, like once you graduate, it starts to feel a lot slower than you would expect. But it's everything. Like the freshman year starts to become about a lot of firsts, right? For me, it was about like my first day of classes, first time like living alone, first time even doing laundry. It's like the small things, right? Like that you wouldn't expect, that like it starts to become so many firsts. You're exposed to so many new things that you would never have imagined that you would be exposed to. Like it would be your first time going out, your first time making a friend in college, all of that. So your freshman year, you're like, yes, you're like focused on your classes in terms of getting used to that way of learning,
mm,
which is again like completely different because you're put in like silos or like studios or like even big lectures. It really depends on your courses and things like that. But you're given autonomy to start like do whatever, like nobody's checking in on you at all times. Like you're responsible for your own work. If you don't do it, you don't get a grade. Like I'm pretty sure, especially with Indians, like we were always taught like, oh, mom comes into the room, are you doing your homework? Like, what are you doing? Like that's not, no one's responsible for you anymore. You're responsible for yourself. So it's a lot of learning. But like I think freshman year focuses a lot more on the social aspect of college. You're
mhm,
trying out new clubs, you're meeting new people, you're solidifying your friendships at the time. And then I think comes like sophomore year where you're started to get a little bit of a grasp on things like the social life, like who your friends are, what you like to do, like you've explored the city so, to a certain context or whatever. And that's when like the courses start to like kick in. They start to like the gear turns up quite hard. Like freshman year to sophomore year, the jump is really high.
mm,
The 3 years after, the jump is not as high. It's pretty gradual, but freshman year, everyone's kind of in their like fun year, and then you jump to sophomore year with like it's a little bit of a kick. So
mhm,
your priorities then shift to like getting used to school, how to balance the social life that you created freshman year,
mm,
as well as like keeping up with like the load, like the workload and all of that. And you start to like take on a little bit more responsibility because at this point you've lived alone for a year. Like you're starting to get into that rhythm. You start to prioritize things that are important to you, whether that's like health, mental health, like things like that. You start to realize like, okay, these are things I need to start like focusing on outside of like school as well. Like things start to change, and like either you've found your like social circle, you found your like closest friends freshman year, and you're like meeting a couple of new friends and things sophomore year, or what, like things didn't click freshman year and you're trying to meet a whole new group of people. You're trying different clubs, like whatever didn't work, you're trying to change your approach to things when it comes to sophomore year. Junior year and senior year, I think you start to like kind of ride as it goes. Like you've gone through all of those like changes and like learned how to explore everything, and then junior year becomes really about like just kind of going with the flow again. Like I mentioned, like you start to set your priorities, you start to work on those priorities. I think for me it was just like like architecture course loads are just very high. So for
mm,
me, it was like trying to get that. And I've always been really like adamant on having a good social life, which most architecture students do not have by
mhm,
any means. So for me, it was always trying to like get that balance right while also like focusing on my like fitness, which is when I started to take classes like Pilates, hip hop. You start to integrate the fun back into your courses. You start to look at internships more seriously. You
mm.
start to connect with your professors a lot more at this point because you're also taking higher level courses, things that you're actually interested in that are not just requirements. And then finally, I think like senior year, again, like the mentioned the first, this is like a series of lasts. And unfortunately for us, like our second semester was all gone through COVID.
Oh.
Yeah, but you get a lot of like, for us, we didn't even realize a lot of things would be our lasts, but it was our like last time going out together. And then you have a lot of senior activities. Like I remember USC had this thing. We have a local bar where every Wednesday is senior night. So all the seniors would go there and like kind of just Wednesdays have for ourselves and like be
Mm.
with our friends. There's things like that. You start to have so many traditions that you want to do before you leave. And it's like the last time you're living with certain of your roommates, your last time you're seeing a couple of friends who are about to move away until you who knows when, right? Like so it does become a lot of lasts and it is a little sad. But in terms of school, you're pretty much like kind of coasting through because you've got all your main requirements done. And most people try to keep senior year as a light load so that you can actually enjoy your senior year without being bogged down by classes.
Mm.
And yeah, you like walk in as a completely like a complete kid that knows nothing. Like everything is a first. You've never experienced any of it, as you should. Like you're 17, 18. That's what's expected of you. And but when you come out, you're a whole adult. You're in your like 20, you're like in your 20s. You're now an adult, like who knows how to function in society that like 4 years really change you at a pace like no one sees coming.
Yeah, I mean, 4 years of absolutely exponential growth, and a ton of first, especially for us as Indian students. A lot of us are used to just, it's the first time many of us are leaving the country. It's the first time many of us are staying up away from home. A ton of growth and just that whole new world of exposure, the new friend circle. And I'm sure that that is just so valuable. And that's, you also mentioned this was a strong reason to be going to the United States. I have two questions. One, a shorter question, but just one memorable USC tradition that you still sort of remember and smile about. And two, I really want to hammer down for listeners the importance of that one welcome week. So I would love for you to speak about why is it so important, and just if you could share how much ever you remember, some specifics as to what exactly that week looks like.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of traditions, oh, there's so many. Like I mentioned, like the senior Wednesdays, but there's like I think one of the most fun traditions we had was called Conquer. It was right before the UCLA like USC game because we're big rivals in terms of football, and just like I think that football culture gets so taken over into the entire school that like the whole school starts to get involved. We have a massive concert that happens, and we have a fair and all of this, and it's all about like our rivalry with UCLA. Like it's a whole week long. It's called Conquer Week, so it goes on for a week. There's a couple of people that are we have like Tommy the Trojan. That's our mascot.
Hmm.
So they get wrapped up
Hmm.
like those actual statues so that they can't be vandalized and people are keeping guard all night. Like it's so fun when you look at it. Like you can go out in the middle of the night. There's always people like around that statue, like someone or the others guarding. It's like just a fun tradition. Like I know I personally didn't do it, but the football team like tries to go vandalize UCLA's like statue, things like that. Like it's really just such a fun like thing. Another one I really miss is tailgating. So it's the one time where there is no professors, teacher, alumni, and everyone is just there for football. Everyone like we people wake up at 6 a.m. to start partying. Like it's so fun because and it's on campus. Like at this point, this is no longer a school where you're not allowed to like you have to go to classes. Everyone's just like partying on campus at 6 a.m. on a Saturday or whatever day the game is. Like it's a great tradition to be part of.
Hmm.
And in terms of welcome week, I think the importance is like one, you get to meet so many freshmen. Like I got very lucky, like where my roommates are till day some of my best friends, my freshman year roommates. But like that might not always be the case for everyone. Right. You get to meet so many other people. You get put into a couple of activities. You have parties at night, events during the day where you're pretty much exposed to each other for like a week straight all the time. And that's where you end up making your initial connections. Like if you were left to be in classes, honestly, like as much as you're told like you make your friends in school and classes, it's not very true. Like Sure, you make peers in class, like, and it depends on the class. Like, sure, if you have like a fun class like stand up, hip hop, dance, you probably interact with your the students in the class more. But in a typical classroom, like everyone's trying to go in and out and next to the next class as soon as they can. So unless you put on group projects together and things, like the interaction's pretty limited. So you make your friends outside of the classroom a lot more than you do in the classroom. So this is when you have those initial interactions, you start to like feel those like feel that connection with people, like start to realize like, oh, I maybe made my first friends. You start to feel a little bit more comfortable about like moving away from home. So the welcome week really is about the students as much as it is about just like welcome week. It's about like getting to know each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to admit, our welcome week was very overwhelming. Um, Tons of new things, but I think we got a good orientation with the student life team of the city, with friends, making new friends, and with peers. You get some feel for the city. I don't know in your case, but for us, we had different events in different parts of San Francisco, so you get oriented to the city as well. And it's a good intro into just also support systems. Like if this is a problem, contact this person. Might seem boring at first, but this is a week that will probably set up your whole first year to go as smooth as possible. So I cannot like overstate the importance of this welcome week. Not a waste of time. It's great to
Mm.
get it just before jumping into classes.
Yeah,
Um,
I've had friends move in like midweek into or like even the end of fresh like welcome week, and they've definitely had a harder time like acclimating into school than people who've been there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I always recommend go a day or two early, settle down, be fresh for the first day of welcome week. I think it makes a big difference versus
Yeah,
someone who's coming after the week, as you said.
yeah.
Want to segue into university summers. For most of us, it's a longer summer than we're used to in high school. So taking a month and a half to chill is totally understandable. But at university summer, also longer. I've got a 4 month summer, and you
Mhm.
sort of there's some back of the mind pressure to be doing something for your professional growth. Um, also want to stress, and I would love for you to also share this, how you can make a good use of your summer, even if you don't have an internship. Like not having an internship is not the end of your summer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, let's just talk through how you spent the 3 summers of your university journey, and also if you have any good ideas for how to spend a summer beyond just the internship, which many of us might not get after first year.
Yeah, no, also, again, like I think people trying to push themselves into internships like freshman year onwards is honestly pointless. Like, that's just my opinion because you don't know much. You barely like started your courses, you don't know what's going on. Sure, if it's like a smaller internship where you're not required to like learn anything technical, sure. But being you're not nobody's asking you to be pushed into the career field like that early. Like
Mhm.
in fact, take your time, like get to know what you want to do, what you are doing before you get in there. You might even lose interest in what you're doing if you go in prematurely. Right. I've had some very different summers, honestly. Each one of my summers has been extremely different from the other. The summer after freshman year, I came back home. Like I was extremely homesick by the time freshman year was done. Like I really just needed to be home for the 3 months. So I spent a lot of time with my parents. I think that's really important too, because you're living like suddenly moved away from them, right? Like as much as like you want to be there, do your internships, there's that like coming back and being with your family, very, very important. And I also like I had the time, so I was like, okay, there was like a small like model making agency here that like worked on architectural models. It's like, okay, when I have the time when my parents are away at work, sure, I like learn. So technically, while like it could have been like termed an internship, it was a lot more like a workshop or like taking classes where I learned these and I developed a skill that like actually because architecture is so model making heavy at USC that I like learned how to be better at it, more efficient at it. So I ended up taking almost like a course at it. So this was like honestly, my freshman year summer was extremely laid back. Like it was all about just going back home and like reconnecting to like my life back home. And it's also like this is you've had fresh like friends since like a lot, especially in India where you don't really have the like system of like different like primary or like whatever, like high school, middle school, all of that, right? Like you're put in pretty much one school for pretty much all your life. You've had the same friends all your life, and then suddenly you've like gone a year without meeting a lot of them. So you're connecting back with your own friends, all of that. Like that's an important thing. thing to do as well.
Hmm.
My sophomore year, on the other hand, was completely travel intensive. I think I spent like 2 of the 3 months in Europe.
Wow.
Yeah, so we went from Spain to Italy to France to Austria, I think, Greece. Yeah, this we've hit like different places and just studied the like. This was also my first time starting to like learn a lot more about architecture. I'd done the whole like 2 years of it, started to get in deep with architecture, and it was all my dad's idea too, because he's like, I can finally discuss buildings more detailed with you, kind of thing. So we spent 2.5 months like abroad, like in Europe, traveling all these places, just getting to know the architecture, seeing all these beautiful, like not just the typical sites that and like touristy spots that you would expect, but also like these. If you know an architect, like you are like a fan of their work, it it's unbelievable to go experience those buildings in person. So we've gone to some Zaha Hadid, um, like buildings, some Santiago Calatrava, like bridges and buildings, all these things, right? Like you get to actually firsthand see the way they design. And as architects, like who are in the profession, it's really like helpful to be able to go see these like star architects is what you call them, their works and the amount of detail they put into things. So you kind of imbibe those own values into yourself. So, and I'm not saying that's all I did. I completely had fun, went to the beaches, did my shopping, all of that as well. So it was a very like fun summer, and it would not, there is no need for you to like be in the rat race yet, like until you get to even junior year, like
Hmm.
have your fun. Right. That's what university is about. I feel like everyone in this generation's become a lot about like, I need to get that internship, I need to get that job. Like, you can have fun, it's fine. And my summer after junior year, I stayed back in LA. I like, at also this point, I'd like taken on, I switched to the 4 year program, taken on a business minor instead of the 5 year architecture program. So I had like a little bit of a heavier course load coming up for like my junior and senior year. So after like my junior year was done, I decided to take on summer courses, stayed in LA, explored LA, but also like took on a lot of my summer courses so that my senior year load wouldn't be that high and I could enjoy it. And the fun thing was that I didn't realize a lot of my friends ended up doing the same thing. None of us had planned it. None of us like had really talked about it. Some people ended up having internships, but like a lot of people ended up taking courses in school. So you got to connect with people on a way more like one-on-one base because like there's not as many events going on. There's not as much chaos going on. Summers are pretty chilled out. There's like maybe 5 or 10 people like that like of your friend group that like stays back. So you
Hmm.
get to like hang out with them more, connect on a more personal basis. So you can build like relationships like when you tend to stay through like the more quiet periods. So yeah, like every year it looked vastly different for me. Like I've definitely like the summer of sophomore year, like when I did have that 1 month after Europe, like I worked with my parents, I got to know how the company works a little bit. So I'm definitely saying like don't lose touch completely from like things. You can definitely take on an internship, but there's so many more ways to explore.
Yeah, yeah, and I know a lot of my friends are working on very cool projects. Like learning an interesting experience is not just through the internship. A lot of it is just building, exploring your field. Online courses are a great way. I personally don't have an internship this summer, but it's led to this beautiful project of the podcast, which has been going really well. So also a great time to take up interesting projects, which for all you know will continue on even after you go back to university if you feel that they have scope to grow and expand.
Yeah.
Um, I'm glad you touched upon this because my next question actually wanted to break this down a bit further. But say more about switching from the 5 year architecture program to the 4 year program, and why was the business minor so important to you? I know from a previous conversation that you also missed out on a potential study abroad experience because of this decision. Walk through sort of take us through how you were thinking about this decision and the why.
Okay, so when I like initially joined university, like I was pretty sure like I wanted to do the traditional architecture route. In 5 years, you get like your ability to apply for the licensing, like you become an accredited architect. Like it's a whole like set process pretty much. Like you have a whole list of requirements that is pretty heavy, honestly, for what like that course is. Architecture is one of like the hardest heavy like courses that you can take. It
Hmm.
extremely jam packed. Like I decided to still like try to get a minor in business in it, like, but it was not easy to balance the two. So I ended up taking courses in business here, there, like that. My intention towards going to USC was so that I could pursue both. But upon like my first 2 years, like I started to realize how hard that was, like especially with like the course load that comes with architecture. And this was during one of my classes that we had this course requirement that was about the different avenues you can, the growth or career paths in architecture. That so it started to highlight everything from like how to be like what it is to be a traditional architect, the different ways you can get there, the 5 year program, 4 year program, the masters, whatever, and like lighting design, structures. There's so many different avenues that you can explore by doing a major in architecture. And through this course, I started to realize like there was an option for me to like the masters kind of like fit my overall plan. I think towards that, I've always wanted to get a master's. I just didn't know if it would be right after, like a couple of years down the line, like what that looked like. But I knew I wanted to get a master's in architecture. And talking to this professor more, and also like talking to my college counselor a little bit more, both of them encouraged me to switch to a 4 year program. That way I can pursue my minor in business, which was, I think, like for me, like I've always known that I was going to join my family's architecture firm. Like I was going, and I'm also an only child. So it was always like, I'm the next in line for the company kind of thing. And I don't want to be the reason that like the company doesn't continue to grow the way it has with my parents. So I always thought like understanding the principles of business were very important for that. So it was always about like for me, it's always been like the right. Like I guess I've always known that I need to know both. Like I think that's the right way to phrase it. Is like I need to be able to be good at both business and architecture to continue to grow the way that we have. Um, so I've always like I think having talked through this decision, it made a lot more sense to me to like continue with my masters right after. Like the masters would go from like a year and a half to a 2 year program versus like doing a 5+1 or a 4+2 started to look pretty much the same at the end of the day. And I figured like a 2 year in a master's program would give me a lot more um, in depth like knowledge, which is more like related to the real world practices than an undergrad is, because the undergrad program, in certain way, like for its benefits or not, tends to remove real life experiences to a certain degree, just so that you can understand and be as creative as possible without being bogged down by like the realities of what exists. So I thought that made a lot more sense for me personally. And with switching, I was able to take a lot more electives. Like I took things like the coding based architecture, took a lot more classes in terms of software. I took like Revit, V-Ray, things like that, which not only built up my like base of knowledge, but I started to gain proficiency in terms of software, which is very, very sought after in like the architecture world. People who are proficient in multiple softwares always have an edge. So yeah, it
Gonna-
turned out to be a decision for
Sorry,
me.
sorry. Finish
No,
it.
no, no, sorry. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm going to keep this question broad. So, however you want to tackle it, but in terms of the overall experience, how was the master's different from the undergrad?
Okay, so in a lot of ways, so I ended up in Boston for my master's, going from a big city like LA to going to a more college city. I won't even say it's a college town, but a college city like Boston. It's very different. It's so used to being in LA, you're so exposed to being explored to so like exposed to so much, like the kind of people, the kind of diversity, all of that. Versus Boston is not as diverse. I would say it's a lot smaller. The kind of places that you have access to, all of those differ. So that was my initial exposure to being in Boston. But in terms of the course itself, it's a lot more. So I also did like a very different course than a typical master's. I did a course where you have a required 3,000 working hours to be completed in order to graduate. So you're working full time in like that is completely at your discretion whether you try to do volunteering work, you work in an architecture from whatever scale you want it to be, whatever that is. I worked with, I think, 3 firms in the process. So I worked with one architecture firm to begin with. Then I worked with the construction and design company. And then post that, I decided to go back into an architecture firm where I like continued post graduating for a bit and then moved to India. So it really is like a very, and I also volunteered at the time in a local community where we were rehabilitating that entire community. So it was like fun projects like that and getting work experience. So I got first-hand work experience while completing my master's. So it really was, the entire program was imbibed in like the realities of the architecture world and the architecture profession. So you got to first-hand like see what is required with the profession. And also in terms of projects and things that they give you, you're required to comply with like the codes that exist on that site, etc., etc., that like undergrad doesn't necessarily go very deep into. Right? Like undergrad's all about like how creative you can be, how different you can be, like why should your project stand out? Whereas masters then becomes how is this buildable? How is this practical? Would it work for what you're creating? And I think that's like it's important to know both. And having done both, I was able to get the both experiences.
Yeah, definitely is important to know both. Um, your quick question, your master's was just in architecture, or was it, do you have to choose a specific subfield for master's?
I'm doing a master's of architecture specifically. So when you do a 4 year program, that's like really your only avenue because you got to finish your architecture program per se to get your licensing. They have a 5 year requirement to get licensed anywhere, even in India. Like it's a 5 year requirement of doing architecture to get your license. So, I mean, if you're doing a master's, I mean, if you're doing the 4 year program, it becomes a 4+2 of a master's versus if you're doing the 5 year program, you do a 5+1 or 1.5. Sometimes that's what realistically happens. But when you do a 5 year architecture program, you have a bigger array of avenues in terms of what you can do. You can do like a master's of urban design, of landscape, of whatever like you're interested in specifically. A masters of sustainability has become a thing of late as well. Um, but on like for me, like I've always wanted to do a masters of architecture specifically, just because it does encompass a lot of these other things. Like, sure, you don't go into as much of detail, but you do explore all these different avenues as well as like I had like our school was also known for its real estate program, so I got to do some of that. I got to do a couple of classes in like, real estate, in public policy, things like that while doing my master's. And with the like 3,000 hour work requirement, I ended up working with like very cool like firms, like some of them like internationally acclaimed firms like Alcasman and Freddie, Can Design, Shamat Construction. I also had this like really cool project where I there was a neighborhood in near Boston, in Massachusetts, near Boston, and we got it rehabilitated using lighting design. Lighting design was something I'd not necessarily learned in school, but through these opportunities, I got to explore like lighting requirements, lighting design, and all that. So, like whichever avenue you go down, you get still get to explore like what your interests are in whatever way that is.
Very cool. And just from my understanding, the path you took of the 4+2 versus the 5+1, are both equally common, or was yours a more non-traditional and less common path?
It's definitely a less common path. Also because not many people know that this path exists. In fact, I didn't know. Like I've been part of like the architecture like fraternity, I guess, since I was born. My parents, like, I'm sure, like, they have friends who've gone on to become professors, etc., etc. Like, and this path doesn't very much exist in India yet, or even in a lot of other countries. I think it is a path that is a little bit more common in the US and is being more advertised of late, which didn't exist back then when we were students. I remember, like, I think maybe 5 or 6 of us decided to take this shift. And then not just for like pursuing a master's, that was my goal, was to pursue a master's after. There were some people who wanted to go into not exactly like architecture, but architecture related professions who decided to do the switch as well. So it really helped. And some people, like, it even helps in terms of like some people are not able to handle the rigor of like the 5 year architecture program as well, like because it's very studio intensive and you're pretty much confined to just architecture outside of your other requirements, that is. And they wanted to explore like the non-traditional path, like, and then explore like you can obviously still get jobs like out, even if you're not a licensed architect, you get like jobs outside of being you require the licensing to be able to approve drawings and working like construction drawings, all of that. Like in terms of, but you can work in architecture companies with as like a working drawing person, someone who does 3D models, etc., right? Like someone who's technical architectural support, like whatever that is, like whatever your interest is, you can definitely even get into the professional field, but with doing the 4 year program, which was not told to us until like we took that class. And I, by chance or by fortune, whatever it was, ended up taking that class earlier than was on the required list because it fit into my schedule better. I ended up taking it at the start of junior year, which is typically taken in like senior year. So I wouldn't even known this path existed if not for that.
And by senior year, I'm guessing most people have made up their minds to do the 5 year. So this is interesting. If someone listening to the podcast doesn't know about this, I think this is a valuable insight for someone who maybe like you wants to do a major in architecture and then a minor in business or anything else relevant and sort of wants to take a path similar to yours. I think this is an interesting option
Yep.
versus the traditional path which everyone tells you about. So yeah, I mean, very practical tip. Love that. Last question before we move into our fast fire round. It's been a great conversation so far. Just curious how you made your application for the master's program stand out as much as possible through certain activities or projects you were engaged in during USC undergrad.
Yeah, so again, like it was kind of very similar in terms of like applying to undergrad versus applying to masters, right? Like they want you to be yourself, but they also want you to be well rounded. And having done the 4 year program, I think gave me that advantage where like, yeah, I could pursue business, which was different than a lot of other people had done for the master's program. On top of that, like I got to explore a lot of these like technical classes. Like I took a couple of courses on Revit, on Rhino, on V-Ray, Lumion, things like that, right? Like, so I became technically very strong and proficient in so many softwares that, like I mentioned before, gave me an edge in terms of application. Also, because, like, not only does the professional field look for this, but even a classroom with someone that is proficient, the way like schools think about it is also she's going to be a resource to other students as well. Right? Like, so that's definitely helped. And outside of like the typical architecture, like application weaving, I was part of a club called Rishi, which Project Rishi, which worked on rural habitation of rural urbanization of like uh, cities in villages in India. So we did a lot of like dental camps, career camps, things like that. We created like career opportunities for women where we had them do hand embroidery, things like that, which they're known for, and try to bring them into like a commercial market, both in India and the US, things like that. So these like show people that you're like involved in the community, you care about people just outside of like your immediate circle, things like that. I think that definitely helped because I like all schools are looking for someone who can make the world a better place, who
Mm.
cares enough to make the world a better place. And I think that definitely helped me stand out in some ways. And on top of that, like, sure, like I've done those like courses and like whatever, in, not, in, I wouldn't say internships, but like what I mentioned, these experiences that I've had, like showed them that I was more well-rounded to be able to like and ready to take the masters. I think a lot of people like one of the things like schools try to gauge is are you ready for that masters? Because it is a pretty intense environment, like a lot more intense than you're accustomed to in an undergrad. So I think it's a lot about that, like if you're ready or if you're not ready or if you would make a good student or not.
Are you ready? Is from an academic viewpoint or any other viewpoint?
Academic, because it starts to get very rigorous in terms of like you're thrown into you're not expecting it. You think like a master's is an extension of the undergrad that you've done. It's a whole other ball game. You're like they do not care if you have a personal life or don't, if you have a university life or don't, right? Like masters then starts to become purely about the course, not about like your experience in college and all of that. So academically they care, but also life wise, I think they want someone who's had experiences in life. Like if you've done nothing, just gone to school and come, then you're not as ready to be like able to like because now you're a full grown adult. Like they're trying to see like if you would be an adult that would be helpful to society, would be helpful to their school, or someone that's just going to come in to like learn and leave.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good distinction. Someone who's just going to come in, sit in a class, take knowledge and leave, versus someone who's going to really add value to the prof, to the class, to their peer groups. They want those kind of people. So
Yep.
lovely distinction. I also will just re-say a gem which you said, which is that all schools in the all over the world are just looking for someone who cares enough to make a difference and make the world a better place. So, however that applies to a high schooler's application in terms of essays, extracurriculars, how you present yourself, I think that's a gem. Just wanted to say that again. Um, awesome. We'll move to our fast fire round of questions, which is going to be more fun and exciting. Always my favorite part of the podcast. But I'm just going to be throwing you questions like bullets and for
Okay.
you to answer in just one short phrase or sentence. So, um, architecture student would love to know your favorite piece of architecture anywhere in the world.
Okay. So I know everyone typically expect a building, but Baca the Roda Bridge by Santiago Calatrava. This is in Barcelona. Beautiful.
Have to visit someday. Awesome. Your option B major if you hadn't majored in architecture.
Business.
You've done business. Your favorite place to chill, hang out in Los Angeles.
Santa Monica, like promenade, the beach, all of it, just Santa Monica. The Grove is a big one, or this beautiful drive called Mulholland Drive, like a beautiful viewpoint there and everything. So depending on the vibe, one of these three places.
Your might be a tougher question, but don't duck it, please. Your least favorite course or your least favorite class over the 4 years of USC.
Hmm. Okay, so this is a tough one. In the moment, it felt like the least favorite. I think it was one of my studio courses sophomore year. It's studio then becomes a lot about like your opinion versus a professor's opinion, right? Like
Hmm.
so it seemed like studio was at the moment it seemed like one of my least favorite classes. Now that I think about it, you face that so much in the real world that it was really helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, just you can only see that in retrospect. I'm sure you might have hated the class when you actually took it, but
Yeah.
some things come in, you realize the value after years. So maybe push through some classes which you think you hate now. If I were just to extrapolate, because later on will be helpful.
Yeah.
Math for sure, in my case. um, an underrated but still super necessary skill to be a really good architect.
It's all about being able to shift your perspective. You have to be able to see so many different perspectives at the same time, right? Like you have to be able to see the big picture while also concentrating on the details. You have to think about the customer and the client while also thinking about the community that you're designing for. So you're constantly having like so many different things that you're taking into consideration, even in designing the tiniest of details.
Hmm, love it. To wrap up, one piece of advice or insight which you'd love to provide to a high schooler who's currently in the process of university applications and will soon be embarking on this beautiful journey?
Yeah, this is something I think I mentioned at the start of the podcast is college is definitely more than just your classes. It's about making the most of every opportunity that you're presented with. It's the friendships, the courses, the people you meet, the professors you meet. Like this is even in terms of like academically the professors and but the different clubs, like if you're in a city and you're not exploring the city and you're just stuck on campus, you're missing out on that opportunity as well, right? Like explore everything. These 4 years are like some of the only time that you're going to be able to get to truly enjoy and like explore. Once you get into the real world, like you have to take leaves and this and that. Like once you get like working in a professional setting, so just really make the most of it. And like even while choosing your colleges, it's not always just about the course. It's about so much more than that. And the memories you take out of it are not the courses you've been in, the professors you've had. It's about the friendship, the memories you make, like the places you've like seen. That's what you take away from it.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think again, a senior gave me great advice saying that life begins at the end, at the outside of your comfort zone, and the campus is a comfort zone. So spend time outside the campus and engage with the city you're in. The campus might have everything you need to live and function, but what for some of the valuable memories will be in the city outside of campus, and that's also where the real world is.
Yeah.
The campus is not a fully accurate representation of how the real world is and works.
It's definitely not. You're in such a bubble when you're on campus, as much as it simulates a real world. It's not even close. You're in your protected bubble at all times when you're on campus. You get to experience so much more. If even if you step a street out of campus, like
Hmm.
you see a whole new world there.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, unfortunately, I keep saying this. All great things, all great conversations have to come to an end. This has been lovely. It's been a long, full of insight and wisdom conversation. If a listener is super interested to hear more and has more follow ups, wants to connect, what's a good way to reach you?
Yeah, like feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram, perks at perks15. Sorry, perks_15. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It like, and all of you listeners, like you're like more than welcome to reach out to me whenever.
Awesome. Been a great episode. Thank you so much for your wise words on University Unraveled, and a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that was the episode. To all the young listeners out there, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you feel more energized, inspired, and curious for the exciting university journey that lies ahead. Stay tuned. Many more wonderful episodes to be released on Uni Unveiled across a diversity of majors, countries, institutions, and speaker profiles. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Uni Unveiled. This podcast is just a small part of a much larger initiative undertaken by my family called Serene Strokes to spread positive sparks of growth, transformation, and joy among all our audience. Check out our official website www.serenestrokes.com. In the description and comments, please feel free to share other topics and questions which you would love to hear about from our different speakers on this podcast. Until then, take care and remember that this big word, university, may not be as scary or as intimidating as you think it is. Thank you for listening to Uni Unveiled.